Committee Room 4A, sound.
We're grateful to you for joining us this morning as we take further evidence on our inquiry into resilience and electricity resilience in the United Kingdom. Would you like, first of all, to introduce yourselves, and if you'd like to make an opening statement, please feel free to do so. And I should just alert you to the fact that we are being recorded, so everything you say will be on the record.
I'm Dr. David Clark. I'm Chief Executive of the Energy Technology Institute, ETI. We're a public-private partnership carrying out design and analysis around the UK energy system out to 2050, and then investing in major technology demonstration and engineering demonstration projects to try and address the challenges in delivering those solutions.
Kevin Anderson. I'm Professor of Energy and Climate Change at the University of Manchester and Deputy Director of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. And also for my sins today, I'm the principal investigator on a project looking at the resilience of the electricity network in Great Britain.
Now, I'm Matthew Bell. I'm Chief Executive of the Committee on Climate Change, which is the Parliament and the government's independent advisor on issues related to climate change and climate budgets.
Thank you very much. Well, if none of you want to make an opening statement, shall I start with a rather general first question? Would you like to tell us how you think that electricity resilience in the United Kingdom compares to other countries in Europe and North America? Oh, I'm sorry, I got the wrong one again. Sorry, start again. I'm always doing this. Now, how do you expect climate change to impact on the resilience of the electricity system?
Shall I start off, and others can jump in. It's worth saying to start off that there are probably at least three ways to think about the resilience of the electricity system as it relates to climate change. The first of those has to do with protecting the electricity network, generating stations, substations, the extent to which it is resilient to the effects of climate change, such as flooding, high winds, those kinds of, and weather, those kinds of things. And so one issue of that the Committee on Climate Change and the Adaptation Subcommittee has looked at is both climate change-related events and weather-related events. Is the network resilient to those? There's a different issue, which is about meeting changes in demand that we foresee over the next 20, 30, 40 years. Changes in demand because, for example, cooling becomes more important, changes in demand related to electric vehicles, changes in demand related to electricity for heating. Demand might change, and is the network and is the infrastructure we have resilient to that? And the third issue is in actually the generation of electricity itself. And so clearly one of the recommendations coming out of the committee and one of the recommendations in the government's carbon budgets is increased use of renewables, some of which are intermittent, increased intermittency of generation, and does that have an impact on the resilience and our ability to meet demand? So the resilience of the network, one way of thinking about it, falls into each of those three categories, and what you do in each of those three areas has an influence over how resilient a network is. I'll pause there, and then clearly if there are questions on any of those three areas.
Would either of your colleagues like to come in on this?
I think just from my point of view, I just want to emphasise the kind of clarity and distinction between the question of how do we expect climate change to impact versus any response we choose to put in place to meet climate change targets in terms of energy system targets. because I think, as Matthew just highlighted, there's certainly in terms of climate change and the potential that we see there, I think there are sort of two key issues that we'd identify in the context of the UK, one of which is the potential for warming and hence increase in demand, particularly for air conditioning in terms of electricity loads, but also the potential risk for, frankly, what I think is uncertain at this stage in terms of cold weather in the winters and how long we may see cold spells, what the duration is, what the intensity is. And I think that's more uncertain. But those are what I would very much classify as effects that we will see as resulting from climate change. But then there is clearly the targets that we set nationally in terms of what policy measures we want to implement and what energy system designs we adopt as a consequence. And I think those two things need to be treated quite differently. One we have to react to and deal with. The other one is of our own making, in essence. We are choosing what kind of energy system we want to put in place.
Would you like to speculate on the first of those, the effects that climate change will have on demand patterns?
I think, from my perspective, I think the air conditioning position is one that we need to be very conscious of for two reasons, one of which is we are seeing warming in summers. Reports even today suggest we're going to continue to see warming in summer spells. We are seeing increased rollout of air conditioning in new build developments in cities in particular. That's happening already. And clearly the consequence of that could be a trickle-down effect to a broader section of the economy and broader sections of the residential population in terms of that happening. So the air conditioning piece we can see happening. And the demands that places on the system are quite significant compared to most loads in a house today. I'm talking about residential properties. The cold weather situation, I think, is far less clear as to what will happen there, as to whether we will actually see deeper, longer cold spells or not. And I think that's something that the Met Office are probably best placed to advise on from their perspective, and also the Tyndall Centre.
I agree with both my colleagues here. You can split this into supply and demand, and I'm going to focus just initially on the demand side. Again, there could be additional air conditioning load on the grid. And to give some sense of what that might mean, we currently consume very approximately about 350 terawatt hours of electricity in the UK. That's our final energy consumption. That might not mean a lot to some of you, but it might mean something to others. But the air conditioning load, from some of the work we've done within our project ResNet, suggests that that could look similar to total current electricity demand. So air conditioning load, as we go forward with a warmer climate, could be as big as total electricity demand today. If you add to that a lot of discussion, which some of you will no doubt have heard about electrifying cars, at the moment cars consume, in terms of diesel and petrol, including light vans as well, about the same amount of energy as the total grid again, about 350 terawatt hours. If you then look at domestic heating in the UK, that the previous chief scientist, David Mackay at DEC, was talking about having significantly put onto the grid, principally through heat pumps, at the moment that is about 350 terawatt hours. So you start to think about this. This is a grid that is 4 times larger if you put heating, air conditioning, and transport on the grid, 4 times larger than current electricity demand. If you then want process heat for industry, for cement making, for steel industry and so forth, that is also about another 350 terawatt hours. So people keep talking about electrifying things, but this does mean that you can become much more efficient, and maybe that will reduce half of these loads. But nevertheless, the size of the grid for these futures is very much bigger than today. I would suggest that currently the grid provides about 20% of our energy, and if we are serious about climate change, then it needs to move towards 60 to 80% of the grid. So that is, of all electricity demand, rather. So it needs to be 3 or 4 times larger than it is today, or we need to become phenomenally more efficient than we are now. All of that has to be played out against the fact is that if we're honest about this, we do not know what the wind conditions are going to look like in the future. We can say something about temperature, mean temperatures across the UK. We're very poor at understanding what the extremes will look like, and infrastructure is very susceptible to the extremes as well as the means. The means are important. The ongoing warming has a big impact on the grid. But nevertheless, the extremes are important, and we're not good at understanding those at the moment. Similarly for wind, we are very poor at understanding extreme impacts of wind, and we're very poor at understanding the direction of the wind going forward. And wind is interesting to think about. Even if the wind speeds only go up a little bit, the damage is roughly a cube law. So you increase the wind a little bit, the amount of damage goes up by a cube of that. So there are lots of unknowns about the future. So if you want to build resilience into that, you have to bear in mind that we don't know, firstly, what the grid's going to look like in terms of its demand profile. And if we're serious about climate change, basically you have to electrify a huge proportion of UK energy demand. And that has to be played out against the fact, if we're really honest about this, we do not understand what the climate impacts will look like in terms of important characteristics such as wind, rainfall, and temperature. So I'm not helping you probably make a very clear picture of this, but we need to be honest that the future is incredibly uncertain, both from a climate perspective and from what we actually are going to do in terms of our infrastructure itself.
Lord Willis.
Can I just follow up that on a simple question, because it's a very depressing picture you've just painted. And what I'd like to ask all three of you, but particularly yourself, Professor Anderson, is whether you feel that given the current policy in terms of government policy in terms of climate change, which fits into international and global policy, is the government sufficient, is their policy sufficiently clear in order to actually maintain resilience, certainly say up to 2050?
There's a lot actually in that question, but the first thing is that government policy, and we may have some disagreement about this, but government policy on climate change domestically is not consistent with our international commitments. I've made this point repeatedly to numerous committees. You could drive a Maersk ship sideways to the gap between the two of these. So what we're agreeing to do domestically in terms of our mitigation efforts are completely at odds or not inadequate for dealing with the 2 degrees C characterisation that we often sign up to internationally, and we will again this year in Lima and no doubt again in Paris next year. So there's a very big difference between those two. So if you look at our domestic targets, we're probably doing things that are broadly in line with those targets. But if the rest of the world did something similar to that, and it's not doing even as much as the UK at the moment, or at least many countries are not, then we're talking about 3 or 4 degrees C future temperature rises, which are very, very large indeed, and according to the CCC's definition, which I would agree with, extremely dangerous. If we go...
This disconnect between international commitments and domestic policy is something that has to be addressed,
yes,
and something which this committee, as part of its response to resilience, should in fact put in, because it's fundamental to resilience, isn't it?
It is, and it's not just that our policies, it's that actually the framing of climate change domestically is incompatible with our framing of climate change internationally. So we make much weaker, we have much weaker sets of targets domestically than those that we imply would be perhaps the best language to use internationally, where we say we're definitely going to stay below 2 degrees centigrade and make all efforts to avoid 2 degrees temperature rise, and yet our policies are much more in line on our domestic targets with a 3 or 4 degrees C temperature rise difference. So this disjuncture has been there for a long time, and lots of climate experts are fully aware of this, but it's something that is being kept relatively quiet.
It's just worth, on that specific issue of resilience and out to 2050, again going back to this distinction between the impacts of both weather and climate related events on the network, as opposed to some of the things, not as opposed to, but on the other hand, some of the things that Kevin was talking about this increase in the size of the network and the generation that we have to have. If you look at, and we were talking about wind earlier and things like that, if you look at weather-related incidents on the network today, the latest report that the Adaptation Subcommittee has published says that weather-related incidents accounted for about 35% of annual disruptions to electricity distribution networks between 1995 and 2010, so over that sort of 15-year period. And that's things like wind and flooding and so forth. There are currently, for example, about 700,000 homes and businesses, 3 water treatment works, 1 hospital, all of which are relying on about 57 substations that are in areas of high or very high likelihood of flooding. So there is a risk there in terms of resilience of those types of things. The Adaptation Subcommittee actually then looked through all of the different sectors of the economy, including electricity distribution, to look at what was being done about those types of issues. And electricity transmission and distribution today was the only sector that the committee felt had adequate measures in place to protect against what is foreseen to happen right now. So it looked at water and electricity and a whole number of other sectors. And it felt that the electricity and distribution transmission infrastructure as it currently is, and with our current understanding of risks, is doing a lot and is adequately resilient. And that follows on in some ways from the 2007 floods and from the pit review that happened, and a lot of recommendations that came out of that about investment that was necessary. The one caveat around that is clearly Ofgem have just completed in the last 10 days or so their price control review, which sets out what companies are allowed to spend on some of these things, and we're still reviewing that. But in terms of the business plans that were put forward and the investment that was put forward. And so that's one aspect of the issue, and a serious aspect, and certainly in terms of going forward, as Kevin was saying, things like wind speed and stuff like that, very unpredictable. We're not sure what's going to happen. But that's one side of the issue. The other side of the issue around what is necessary to meet for example, the statutory domestic targets around an 80% reduction in emissions by 2050, that then involves bringing on the electrification of vehicles, bringing on renewables onto the grid. That involves very significant issues and significant uncertainties, and that's part of what clearly has to be managed going forwards in order for us to understand both the costs of that. Certainly there are other countries and elsewhere in the world where renewables, electric vehicles, all those things are a greater proportion of the grid than they are in the UK currently, but we'll be going to levels that are even higher than those that have been achieved so far.
Lord Peston.
If we place the whole subject within the context of system theory, then we would regard resilience as meaning adaptability to an unexpected shock. There shouldn't be a resilience problem to the mean, if you like, of the system, which is, I think, the point that Professor Anderson is making. Am I right?
Yes. Of course, with climate change, the mean is changing. So today's extreme. So if you talk about the 2003 heat wave, there's been quite a lot of people suggesting that by 2030, with a lot of uncertainty, again, caveats put along this, by 2030 that could be the norm in the UK. Now that was an very extreme event. And if you imagine the air conditioning load that would be there, then you could argue that is a mean, or an extreme that becomes the new mean. And that is one of the big problems here, is that we're not sure of that. Yeah.
Well, but that's, if you like, taking us to the next level up in terms of the difficult theory that we're dealing with anyway. What concerns me is where we know broadly what's going on, but only broadly, there shouldn't be a problem, should there? I mean, rational decision makers should be able to deal with what they know is going to happen. The problem is, is the system capable of dealing with what we don't know is going to happen? I mean, to put it crudely, I mean, you could use more sophisticated language. Yeah. I mean, what's your view on that? So, I mean, are the people taking the decisions capable of showing resilience where they need to?
So that was kind of the comment I was going to make really in the context of the last question as well, which is I think you need to be very cautious about asking a question about do we have policy which is going to deliver a 2050 resilient system. I can guarantee, I mean, we spend millions, as do many other people, including National Grid, on looking at what would be the optimum design for a future UK energy system and electricity system, okay? I can guarantee you, whatever answer I give you, if you put me on the spot and said, what will it look like in 2050, whatever answer I give you will be wrong, okay? Uncertainty and statistics say it will be wrong. If you ask me what it's going to look like in 2030, it's going to be pretty difficult to tell you. So to provide an all-encompassing is policy adequate, yes or no statement, the answer is almost certainly, for the very short term, probably yes. In the very long term, no, it's not. Can it be? No. Okay. So I think you've got to be very cautious about this policy piece for a number of reasons, one of which is just the sheer uncertainty. And the second one, as Professor Anderson highlighted, is if you assume you're going to electrify the entire UK energy system, by which I mean power, heat and transport, by any date you choose to choose in the next 50 years, the answer is you're not going to do it. And the reason you're not going to do it is it is too expensive. And there are many, many alternatives that are far cheaper. So you have to look at the combination of power, heat and transport for exactly the reasons that have been articulated, which is to build a system which could deliver 350 terawatt hours of heat, which is the challenging load for the UK, you'd have to build an entire new national grid. Cost, $250 billion, that kind of number. And to give you the other piece of context, which is if you think you're going to deliver heat in the world that we all understand heat today, where we have a gas boiler in the main or an oil boiler or a coal fire which you turn on and off, the context of doing that using electricity you can't do. the kind of snapshot view, the very simple, simplistic view, 18th of December 2010, gas demand on a Saturday morning in the UK, when it was very cold, went up by 132 gigawatts in less than an hour. In other words, more than the capacity of the national grid was turned on in terms of gas heating in 1 hour. In the next 60 minutes, it went off again, because all houses are warmed up and they came straight back down. So this is my point of, you have to look at this as a system and look at how you would deliver the system in the future. And in that context, you can start to see affordable alternatives. All the design work we do suggests to meet the 2050 targets that we've set ourselves is of the order of 1 to 2% of GDP, additional to a kind of business as usual, no climate change targets kind of world. So the whole point about the system piece is absolutely correct, but it's very important we don't kind of mindset constrain ourselves into it's an electric system, end of story. I think we have to look at this in how do you deliver across power, heat and transport and utilise all the waste heat that comes off various industrial processes, off power plants. How do we utilise that to deliver heat in the future rather than single focusing on delivering electricity into heat? Because if we do, the system will not do it at anything like an affordable level.
Lord Ridley.
It follows on from what Dr. Clark was just saying. Leaving on one side for a moment the question of floods and winds, because we have an issue as to whether we're talking about weather or climate there, whether we, having adjusted to whether we can cope with climate change. Most of what I'm hearing suggests to me that 3/4 of the resilience problem we face in the long term comes from climate policy, not from climate change. In other words, from the desire to go fully to electrification and so on. Now, Professor Anderson said that there could be a 350 terawatt hour, presumably per year.
That's what we presume per year.
Yeah, in a year, exactly. Increase from air conditioning alone. What are the assumptions behind that? How much temperature increase are you expecting to see, and how much rollout of air conditioning? Because anyone can throw a number out. What are the assumptions that have gone into that calculation?
Okay, well, the project is still ongoing, and with air conditioning, we were looking at more extreme temperatures. But having said that, I used half the number that we've come up with so far. So all I can say is the air conditioning load looks very large. Some of our very
temperature assumptions.
We're talking about the more extreme ends of the climate change realm. So if you imagine those playing out in the UK, if you talked about us globally being unsuccessful on climate change, which would be current track, then probably 3 to 4 degrees C global average, and then looking at how that played out within the UK.
What does that say for the UK?
Well, I'd have to go back to look at the details of how that came out for the UK.
But more than 3 to 4 degrees?
Say again?
More than 3 to 4
Well, no, we'd probably be somewhere near the average, I would have thought.
So 3 to 4 degrees?
Well, as I said...
Over what period?
This would be taken out to 2050. Our analysis
by
goes
2050, 3 to 4 degrees.
This analysis goes out between 2050 and 2080. What I'm trying to say there is that there are so many uncertainties there as to how climate change will play out in that period, not least what our emissions will be. So what we tried to look at for air conditioning load was what would the extreme look like, because the reason for this was to test the grid, and then to start to say, well, how can you come back from the extreme? Firstly, the temperatures may not be that bad. Secondly, we may significantly improve the housing infrastructure. So there's a whole suite of things. Now, if you put some of those in place with the worst end of climate change, that brings you down to 350 terawatt hours. Now, there are no doubt there are other things we can look at, and we are looking at, to try and bring it to lower than that. But the air conditioning load, and also we normalise those sorts of practices. It's not as if you just have to have that to live. You normalise living in those sorts of properties. I mean, most of us here were brought up in houses that we would never warm to the levels we warm them today. And of course, most of us here probably don't air condition our houses today. So how we respond is not sort of just relating to temperature. How we respond relates to the new norms that we put in place. And when we looked at those collectively, and I say this work is ongoing, then it looks that the air conditioning load could be very large. So what we need to be able to do, because we're working with National Grid, is just to let National Grid know that that is a potential big impact. And actually for them, they're not so interested in the terawatt hours. They're interested in the peaks, because of course this occurs primarily in the summer. So the actual impact on the grid is enormous, because it's not spread evenly over the year, quite obviously. It's spread across principally the summer periods. And that is a real problem for National Grid.
Am I right, I'm looking at Mr. Bell for a second here, am I right in thinking that contrasting with 3 to 4 degrees over the next 35 years, which Professor Anderson has mentioned, the warming over the last 35 years has been about half a degree or less?
Yes, we haven't seen warming of 3 to 4 degrees over the last 35 years.
Why this sudden jump, assume?
Well, I mean, we haven't got any graphics here, but here we have the CO2 emissions in the last 50 years. Here we have the CO2 emissions currently. Here happens to look at the trends. CO2 is a greenhouse gas. You link the two together, and that gives you something that links to temperature.
Lord Wade.
Thank you, Chairman. I mean, in a way, that discussion you just had was the sort of discussion that I wanted to have, because I must tell you I'm very sceptical of the Tyndale Centre. They always take extreme positions, and I've had experience with them at Manchester in the past. And I think that, again, I ask you the question in a way that just been asked you. I mean, on what facts do you make? I mean, the point is, temperature hasn't gone up. And there's an awful lot of people who might believe like you do, but there's an awful lot of people who don't believe like you do. Why are they always wrong and you're always right? And what evidence have you got, and you've got none, that proves that your concepts are right and everybody else's is wrong? Maybe temperatures won't go up. So I'm much more inclined to agree with Mr. Clark's concept that really to make sudden decisions now to solve problems that may never appear, though you would never do that in a business. You would never sensibly invest money to say, look, this is the worst situation that may happen in 20 or 30 years' time, so I'm now going to borrow all this money to solve a problem, and it might never come. And so surely the way to deal with these issues is to have a plan that you can deal with them if the problem arises. And probably, to go as Mr. Clark so rightly says, Dr. Clark, we adapt a system that is more adaptable as time and circumstances change. But at the moment, there's no proof that what you're saying will ever happen.
Can I just make one comment about the system adaptability piece before we perhaps pick up on that, which is, I think, it's very important that if you adopt an approach that says we have a system and we are seeking to adapt it, that we understand the implications of how we would adapt it, and we understand those early. So you don't want to be, in inverted commas, making it up on the fly in 2030 and making billion-pound decisions at that point without the evidence to know what you are doing and why.
You did make, as I understand it, was that if you were to make a decision that these changes are going to have to be made in the future, and then there's some fundamental changes needed to be made in our policy at this stage. I mean, we've taken evidence already that maybe if we assume that there's going to be a big serious problem from carbonisation, well then we maybe change how we produce temperature. Maybe we spent much more on trying to produce energy in a different form and invest into those activities rather than to try and solve a decarbonisation problem. But, in other words, if I knew that some problem was going to arise as a result of something that I didn't really know, well, then I would say, is this the best system to be using to cope with that problem if it arises? Maybe it isn't.
And if I just say that what I'd want to do now, in my world, which is exactly what we try and do, is I'd want to be testing possible designs now,
correct,
which
absolutely.
is important from an engineering point of view, why to do these big demonstrators like CCS demonstrators and so on. So it's important we test.
Could we hear from Professor Anderson, please?
Quickly, if you could give me some evidence outside the committee about the extremes that you think we've taken, I'd be happy to respond to those and see if they are not, or whether they would agree with not.
I'm not going to even
Okay,
go
that's
into an
fine.
argument with you.
The second part about that is I'm really not interested in yours or anyone else's or scientists' beliefs. I'm interested in conclusions. So I'm not sure what the general public think about quantum mechanics. I'm also not sure what the general public think about cancer treatment. But I would probably go to the specialists for both of those. Similarly, you may well be right, along with other people who take their sort of, I don't know about your background, but often a non-scientific approach to concluding something that's a scientific issue. But by and large, I would take the views of the experts. And looking at what other evidence is out there from the majority of climate scientists, then they would broadly hold to the position that was demonstrated very clearly in the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. Now, you may well believe that they're wrong. I will go with the scientists and the experts' conclusions rather than the beliefs of yourself or indeed other non-experts in that area. And you can choose which set to go to. You can listen to the astrologists or the other people that may give you health treatment, or you can go to the experts. My personal view is to go to the experts. We may differ on that.
Lord Browse.
I can follow up on that, because you said just earlier on that you have and I wanted to just ask a question. I'm an engineer. I'm used to large calculations. I'm quite an expert in that. And I know that it's extremely difficult to draw up boundary conditions and to understand what you're doing. and I've looked at the climate, the overall temperature thing, I can see that you can come up with some credible models for the overall models of the atmosphere and predict temperature increases. But you said yourself just now that you have a very poor understanding of how you will predict weather and violent weather. And yet the panels and that make very confident statements that the weather is becoming more violent. And so you've contradicted yourself there. Now, can you...
So who says it's becoming more violent?
Well, I hear it all the time.
No,
we've got it in our evidence here. I could read it out. Well, I won't find it now.
Okay.
There's evidence here that we are already seeing floods consistent with the projected consequences of climate change and storms highlighted against the cost, damage and disruption, all in here. So this statement is made quite often, and yet you were saying that, and it always baffled me quite how you calculate the weather changes and the likelihood of storms when you've got relatively small changes in temperature. So my more constructive question is enough being done to improve these models?
You asked the modelers, and they'll always want a larger computer. I don't think... Certainly the models are improving, and one of the big problems is that they need to bring them down to a point. I'm not a modeller, I'm not a climate change modeller, I'm actually an engineer as well. You need to bring them down to a level where they can give you some useful information at smaller grid square areas, so smaller geographical areas. At the moment, they are reliable at sort of larger grid squared areas, but if you're trying to bring them down to understand infrastructure issues in particular parts of a country, or even a country as small as the UK, it is very challenging to do that. So the models need to be improved, and indeed the new suite of models that are coming out will give us better robustness at smaller grid squares. But if we ever expect to be able to predict storms, what will happen on particular months in 2050 or 2060, then we will be sorely disappointed. We will not be able to give that sort of output. But we do know that we're putting more energy into the system. So there may be small temperature rises, but the energy increase in the system is actually very large. And that energy generally plays out in a whole series of events, which mean increases in means, but also increase in extremes. But I do take some umbrage with you saying that we're always talking about the extreme weather now being related to climate change. I read a lot of the reports, not the ones in the press. I'm not interested in what the journalists tell us. The science reports. And in those, the IPCC are incredibly careful in the language they use. No doubt if you hunted through the several thousand pages of documents, you can find the odd exception. But by and large, the IPCC and the climate change community has been very careful in the language it uses. So it does not ascribe, for instance, Sandy or Haiyan, or indeed what happened here in the UK last year, to climate change. It may well say they're exacerbated by climate change.
Wrong papers. I'm reading here. The Adaptation Subcommittee of the Committee of Climate Change have stated in their 2014 progress report that the global climate has already changed as a result of man-made greenhouse gas emissions. Here in the UK, land and sea temperatures have increased, sea levels have risen, and rainstorms appear to be intensifying. Last winter floods are consistent with the projected consequences of climate change, and the storms highlighted against the cost, damages and disruptions that extreme weather can do.
I would agree with all of that. There's nothing...
Given that was my organisation that said it, let's be.
Isn't that predicting that this is going?
Let's try to be clear. And I think Lord Ridley is very helpful in mentioning climate and weather and being clear about these things. There are some changes that scientists have ascribed to climate change and man-made climate change to do with, as you were quoting, sea level rise, changes in temperature, those types of things. They have been linked as well to increased storms. Those are not increased sea level temperatures, sea level rise. Those are measurable events, and you can have a discussion about them. What the quote that you read out does not do is it does not say that a particular flood or a particular storm or a particular high wind event has been caused by climate change.
Are consistent with the projected consequences of climate change.
And so
what does that say? It says that, that last winter's floods are consistent with the projected consequences of climate change. This is the Committee of Climate Change that said that.
and it said, which is that the modelling indicates that if you have higher sea level rises, then the chances are more probable that you will get more flooding. But it does not say a particular. To bring this back to the issue of resilience, those types of activities, whatever their cause, the question is the electricity system resilient to them? Going back to some of the things I was saying earlier, is the electricity network resilient to flooding, high winds, those types of things, whatever their cause? And it is important that we understand that, and that is partly clearly what the adaptation subcommittee is for.
I would actually like to hear the witnesses answer the questions.
Yes.
This is not about an argument backwards and forwards.
I think that's fair. That's fair comment. I think we would like to hear from Mr. Bell, and then I want to ask Lord Ridley to come to the next question. But if you'd like to complete, Mr. Bell, I'm sorry for being interrupted.
No, just to finish that thought, there are some things that the climate change scientists and the climate change models ascribe quite closely to climate change, things like sea level temperature, sea level rise, air temperature. There are other things where there's much more uncertainty around them, which is a lot to do with wind speeds, as Kevin was saying, flooding, lightning storms, all those kind of things, where all the climate scientists I think would agree that there's a great deal more uncertainty around the links and exactly how they happen. The issue of resilience is one of, are the networks and is delivery of energy and electricity to households and businesses resilient to those types of unpredictable events, as well as over the next 30, 40, 50 years, are we doing the types of activities that David was suggesting, testing the technologies, starting to embed the technologies, bringing the costs of those technologies down, consistent with what the Committee on Climate Change would say is the most cost-effective path to get us to where we want to be in about 2050.
Now we must move on. Lord Ridley, you're going to ask the next question.
It does actually follow very closely on from what we've just been discussing, because we want to know about whether there are adequate plans in place to ensure that the electricity system can deal with the impacts of climate change. And I think it's important to distinguish here between, on the one hand, the impacts of climate change policy, which we briefly talked about, and on the other hand, the impacts of weather, which, as you said, 35% of current disruptions are caused by weather and will go on being caused by weather, and we can adapt to those and we can adjust to those. What's the extra work that needs to be done for, say, a 10% increase in wind speed, maximum wind speed, presumably, or whatever percentage you think is likely? Or what's the extra work that has to be done because of a change in sea level or a flood risk that wouldn't be done anyway to cope with weather and give you a margin of error?
From our point of view, from an engineering perspective in terms of the answer on that, we've been funding a project recently to look at hazards to the UK energy system. And the message we're getting back from that is that fundamentally there are good systems in place, both nationally and with individual major companies and with government. There are good systems in place for looking at engineering, I'll call it that, related risks around particular weather events and the consequences of an increase in a particular one, wind speed or whatever it is, icing around power stations and lines and substations and so on. The thing where there seems to be less consistent answer, and the area which we are seeing as an area that we need to consider more, is around combinations of events. So the individual events are covered, we think, broadly, but it's combinations of events. So the sea level piece with a wind speed piece, the icing with a sea level piece, and so on. And many of these things do go together to do with air pressure and so on. They tend to get linked. So I think that's the area that we're seeing where there is potentially some risk that needs to be considered more carefully in terms of how we plan. And it's about combinations of risks, but also being realistic about the combinations of risks and not necessarily seeking every kind of edge of envelope possibility, but what are the realistic combinations of risks we think we face in the future. And we're now looking at how we'd actually seek to identify those and what groups in the UK are best placed to do that, and we haven't completed that yet.
But what I'm concerned about is that this could be a very small effect, this combination effect, this extra effect, this marginal difference that climate change will make, as opposed to, because presumably ice storms and sea level rise combine anyway, as it were. I mean, we're already seeing sea level's been rising for hundreds of years, so we're already seeing small impacts of that, etc. In weather like we've got this week, we could have an ice storm because it's cold but very windy, but it's not quite cold enough to be snow, so it could be rain falling on ice and that kind of thing. So what's the extra could be quite small, because we could move through that phase into a phase where ice storms are less likely or something like that.
It could be quite small, and it could be very large. Now, again, we can't give you much information on that either way, but partly because the science is very unclear about those particular extreme events, but also, and I would say probably as a larger signal, is we have no idea how the global community is going to respond to climate change. Currently, it's doing nothing in terms of reducing its emissions. They're going up at 3 times faster rate of growth than during the 1990s. So we don't know what the how much energy there will be in the system going forward, because we do not know what the greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere will be, because we have no idea how we will respond to that challenge, let alone the idea that there's huge difficulties in trying to make accurate predictions of weather. We can be fairly robust on some of on climate, but the difference between climate and weather, as I think most of us understand, is important to understand here. We are doing lots of things, or the grid is doing lots of things. And again, most of you are probably familiar with this. If you think about splitting the grid into 2 parts, you've got the national grid, the big transmission stuff, the high voltage part of the system, and you've got the district network operators, the DNOs, the lower voltage part of the system. And it would appear that my impression is that National Grid are more up to speed with the sorts of impacts that they may well see in the short to medium term than are the DNO, district network operators. But I think it would be fair to say you should question them whether they would agree with that or not. Most of the outages we see are not caused by the national grid going down. They're caused by more localised effects. I think 35% of all outages, short-term outages, are lightning strikes, which, again, we are very poor at predicting what the impact of lightning will be going forward. So I'm not making any, I'm not trying to make great claims to what we can do. What we know is there's more energy in the system going forward, and that these extreme events will likely play out more regularly. But the other point to bear in mind, and now I have to rely on my colleagues for this, is that, as I said before, a small increase in wind speed you referred to has a much larger impact in terms of damage, because there's this cube law associated with it. So I think we have to understand that we may describe it as a small increase in wind speed, but we have to be fair about that and use the language then that would imply a very large impact in damage, or could do, depending on exactly what those numbers were. But I think we have to draw that important distinction between those two. And the other thing I think when we look at will it be resilient or resilient enough or not, comes back to the gentleman's comment about systems. Because we have the electricity system, but the more things that we put on it, we have a whole set of nested systems. At the moment, electricity provides us with our lighting and our whatever else it provides, numerous things it provides us. It doesn't provide us with much transport. It provides us with some trains and trams and some buses, I suppose. But going forward, if more things are on the grid, you might make an argument, actually, we've got a whole suite of nested systems that are now reliant on electricity. So the level of resilience might have to be much higher.
That's the point about climate policy impacting.
Well, no, it's actually not. It's not just climate policy. Without climate policy, we're putting more on the grid. So many of us here, I noticed 1 or 2 laptops around here, as previously they would have been pens and paper. So we are already reliant on a whole host of infrastructures that we wouldn't have been using 10 or 15 years ago. So ICT is very important to us now. And so I would already argue, without climate policy, the issue of resilience is changing anyway, because we're using electricity for a whole suite of things we were not using it for before. And I would argue on top of that, climate policy will add additional things to those anyway.
Lord Dixon-Smith.
Chairman, I'm becoming slightly puzzled because, of course, one needs to be aware of the possibility of the extremes, but I live by the weather in my other career when I'm not in this place, and I've done that all my life. I'm bound to say to those who think that the climate isn't changing that the climate is dramatically different from anything that I grew up in. I used to skate every winter. I haven't skated for years. And well, yes, indeed. But going the other way, I did not understand why you were so concerned about a possible air conditioning power demand surge. Because I spent 18 months in Malaya, God help me, over 50 years ago now. And I have to say, nobody out there at that time had heard of air conditioning, or virtually nobody, and it wasn't an issue, and frankly we lived very, very comfortably. We did have a record low temperature while I was there. It was only 59 degrees Fahrenheit. I can't put that instinctively into centigrade degrees. But you know, the adaptability of people, in my book, will not do anything like the demand for air conditioning that you're describing. It was you, Professor Anderson, right at the beginning. I listened to that, and I'm sorry. You know, when you question one bit,
let's
you question the whole thing.
Lord Dixon-Smith. We'll hear from Professor Anderson.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And in many respects, I would agree with you. It's not that we need air conditioning, is that we are already normalising to it. I have colleagues now in the 1960s building who have now bought portable air conditioning units for their offices. They've been working in those offices for years, and the climate hasn't changed that dramatically that they suddenly have to move to AC units. The problem is we normalise new types of practices and behaviours. I lived in the northeast for a while. I can tell you people in the northeast were wearing T-shirts where people from London would have been wearing coats in that weather. We normalised certain behaviours. And I'm not saying we have to go down that particular route. We could retrofit our houses to help as well, no doubt. And we can learn to put coats and jumpers on. We can do all of those things. But there is a real risk that the grid has to consider that people will, unless there's some legislation to stop it, will likely start to move towards air conditioning loads. We already start to see it in some of the more prestige properties that are being built. They're putting air conditioning units in there. That you can already buy retrofit air conditioning units. A few years ago, people said you'd never heat your garden to have a barbecue outside in the winter, but we now heat our gardens. So there are a whole suite of practices that we put in place that lock in these types of behaviours and normalise them. Though I'm with you, I think there are many things that we can do, and that's one of the things we're looking at in the project to try and bring down what could be the air conditioning load. Are there other things that we can do? Are there practices we can adopt? Are there forms of legislation that could help us reduce the uptake of air conditioning load? Are there retrofit properties to the houses we live in? But nevertheless, in the absence of those things, there is quite a lot of evidence in other countries that you see an uptake in air conditioning load. And we're already seeing that in the UK. We already see the bottom of the curve. Now, I'm with you. I hope the curve suddenly drops off, and I'm sure National Grid do as well. But nevertheless, in the absence of other policies to put that in place, I think it's unlikely that we will not see an ongoing increase in air conditioning load, and that it will not be like Malaya in the 1950s. It'll be more like Dubai now, I think, probably.
Lord Rees.
I want to follow up on the impact of climate policy. First question really is, do you think the policies we have are ever likely to achieve the targets by 2050? And secondly, clearly there's going to be impacts on the nature of the grid and I guess its resilience from the greater dependence on renewables. And I wonder if maybe Dr. Clark would like to start on that.
Well, if I take those in reverse order, so the impact of renewables on the grid, I think it's not just renewables, it's the broader spectrum of what technologies do we implement. And I think to some extent, going back to your last question around the consumer end of this and what people expect, the reality is that we always talk about security, affordability and sustainability, right? We may as well also talk about the trilemma issue of technology, consumers and then policy and business models and how those three things fit together. And the consequence of that is that, probably the greatest certainty is consumers, if I use a very bad phrase, but they will demand stuff in the future. We don't know what it will be, and that's the uncertain bit. But there will be changes. People will want new technology. They'll want different approaches to how they engage with it. And probably the easiest, and that can be supported or destroyed by policy, as we all know. And the easy example I always use is, right now we've got about 220 sort of significant power stations on the grid, bigger than 5 megawatts. 220, that's it. We've got 575,000 solar installations less than 4 kilowatts. 8 years ago, they didn't exist. So things change, and that was driven by policy, right? That was the take-up. Now the cost of that's coming down, and policy is stepping away from it for good reason. But I sort of stress that because it can change, and the grid can change in its nature quite quickly. We've never seen that before in this country, and it's happening. So the point is, consumers can demand things. Whether it makes rational sense or not, it can happen. So your question around how do we see these things changing from an electricity point of view, I think the two issues primarily to be concerned about are vehicles and how electric charging may work on vehicles. But frankly, it's a tractable problem because the ability, in the main, you have the ability to charge a vehicle overnight. Heat is the issue, because if we move towards electric heating, in general terms, when is everybody going to want to turn the heating on? 5 or 6 o'clock on a Friday night in winter. They'll all come on simultaneously if we use conventional heating solutions. So you now say the only way of managing that, if you're in an electric heating world, is you've got to look at the building fabric, you've got to look at how the consumer uses their heating and how the actual heating system works. So suddenly, It's technology, it's incentives to make people retrofit their buildings, it's the business model in terms of how they buy the electricity off who. So it is not a trivial problem, and I think it is impossible to separate the technology, the policy and the consumer piece.
That last just slightly. The late Battersea Power Station, which is what I suppose I have to call it now, the late Battersea Power Station used to heat most of Battersea and half of Chelsea. And not least of our problems is that we insist on putting our power stations miles away from anywhere, so that half the energy they produce, which is actually waste heat, is wasted. And a radical change in that, just from a planning perspective, could in fact do a very great deal to sort that out.
So the reality of what you just said is absolutely correct. The challenge is building an economic power station at a scale and with the infrastructure which can be installed in a kind of near-urban location. And it doesn't have to be right in this, it doesn't have to be in Battersea. 10 miles away would be adequate. You can pipe water that far hot without a problem. And I agree with you, and that's why it's important to look at the system and look at how we utilise that waste heat. And today, the vast majority of our power stations, with heat generation attached, in terms of spare heat, are very large installations which we've had to place out of town for infrastructure reasons, to do with fuel supply and to do with emissions. We've been looking recently at where could you site power stations in the future if you accept you're going to a slightly smaller scale, and the benefits of the scale is you probably need less cooling water. And actually, that's one of the critical drivers, is cooling water, on where you site a significant power station. And what we're starting to see is, certainly in England, we're seeing 30 to 50 sites where you could put a power station, either thermal or small nuclear potentially, but you could put that within an acceptable distance of an urban conurbation to be able to use the waste heat. And most of those are brownfield sites. But you are tremendously restricted by a whole range of issues to do with not just the obvious ones of logistics of getting fuel in, of getting cooling water, but air corridors over power stations are restrained for obvious reasons, for security and so on. So there's all sorts of issues, but we're seeing 30 to 50 sites where we think you could start to place either small thermal or small nuclear plant in the future when you could use the waste heat. But I absolutely agree with you. Using waste heat is absolutely crucial in keeping the cost acceptable at a kind of national level for the infrastructure in the future.
Lord Rees wanted to follow up his question.
Yes, it's clear any investment decision we make now will have an impact extending to 2050 and beyond. And I'd really like to ask, again, perhaps Dr. Clark, who mentioned CCS, whether you think we can ever realistically reach the 2050 targets without CCS, and given that, do you really think CCS will ever be scalable?
So, as I said, we carry out quite detailed analysis around potential designs for the UK energy system out into the future in the context of meeting energy sustainability targets. And the kind of number one message that we would take out of that, this is across the entire power, heat, transport, fully integrated. The number one message that comes out of that is, if you elect not to use CCS, and therefore essentially don't use fossil fuels out to 2050 in terms of power generation, the cost of delivering... Sorry, the first question is, can you still meet climate change targets? Our analysis says you can. So you can do without fossil fuels, but only at a cost. And the cost is of the order of 1% or more of GDP. That one decision is the single biggest decision you make about the UK energy system in terms of the cost of the system. And that gets passed on to consumers. So the question of, is CCS important? To my mind, it is critical in keeping costs down. How do you operate without it? The answer is you have to rely very heavily on nuclear, and you have to rely very heavily on offshore renewables, which is doable, but it brings cost penalties. How do you prove off CCS? How do you prepare yourself for this world of 2050 and test it? The answer is you look at what's going on around the world, you utilise that expertise to a degree, but you need to prove it in the context of the UK engineering systems and the regulatory systems in the UK and the financial desire to invest in the UK from major investors. All of that says You need to continue with the current commercialisation projects that DEC are doing, which are absolutely critical. And you need to get probably between 2 and 5 full-scale plants up and running by the mid-2020s, certainly by 2030, so that the investment community can see the viability or not of those systems. But that's crucial.
Professor Anderson?
I'd agree with a lot of what David said there, but I probably would come back a little bit on the CCS issue. Firstly, I would like to go back to this point that I don't think we are often very vague in our discussion around climate change, quite sort of nebulous framing of it. We have this 80% target for 2050. What I'm saying is that has almost nothing to do with climate change. And we've said that repeatedly for a long time. It is the cumulative emissions that matter. What happens in 2050 is an irrelevance. What happens is the pathway up to 2050, and actually we've left it so late, according to the IPCC carbon budgets, it's really what happens between now and 2030. So we're talking a much tighter time frame from that, and it must be related to the carbon budget. So if you follow the UK policy at the moment, and the rest of the world followed in suit, which is say it is not anyway, but if it did, we would not be aiming for 2 degrees C, we'd be aiming for something which the CCC and many others have defined as extremely dangerous, and certainly if you live in the southern hemisphere and a low-lying island, you'd see it like that. So I think we have to be very clear about what we're talking about in terms of the climate change issues. When it comes to issues of affordability, I think we also have to be careful here to say we're not interested in the price of energy. We will talk about that. We're interested in the price of services. No one cares about the price of energy. What you care about is the price of light, or listening to your CD, or your hoovering, or travelling a mile. And actually that is about the combination of efficiency, and both technical and behavioural efficiency, and the price of energy. And I think we have to bear that in mind. If you can become twice as efficient, which is fairly easy to do in our inefficient world, then you can actually double the price of energy and the price of services remains the same. So I think we have to move away from the idea whether the price of energy is important or is not important. With the CHP issue, combined heat and power, I'm completely in agreement with David. And actually, I think this is really important from a grid perspective. There's been so much discussion around heat pumps, which require a lot of energy, electrical energy, to provide heating, when I think actually we're wasting more than a half. We waste, in most power stations, near 60 to 70% of the energy goes up in heat. Now, we could not use all of that for various thermodynamic reasons. Nevertheless, we could use a significant proportion of that, and I think when we're looking at, if we are going to go ahead with new nuclear stations, we should be seriously considering that. One of my PhDs, who's now submitted and passed his PhD, looked at some detail at nuclear CHP, and he was looking at Hartlepool, because there are many houses around Hartlepool where they have a nuclear power station. If they do go ahead with another one, they could be provided with heating at virtually no reduction in efficiency from the plant. Now, the problem with that is we have economists, and economists in this country like to have high discount rates. If you have a high discount rate, you will build nothing that requires money to be spent, significant capital up front. So until you change the economists, then you will, and the discount rate they apply, you will not build things that have a high capital cost unless it's really driven by some other government policies around that.
So it's good to deflect the blame in a direction.
Yeah. And finally, I'll come back to the CCS issue. Carbon capture and storage is not a low-carbon option. Let's be clear about this. And people often think of it as zero carbon. It's emissions, if it is done well, and these are still quite theoretical assessments because we've not got that many plants to assess this. There's a few papers out there saying if it's done well, they're going to be over 80 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour, which is 5 to 10 times greater than that from nuclear or renewables. So it is still a high carbon energy source, even with a successful CCS, and that's taken across the life cycle of the plant, not just the plant itself, but the emissions across the whole fossil fuel chain. And that's running it fairly efficient, well, as efficiently as we can imagine we can do. So it is still relatively high carbon. You then have to ask the question, going back to quantifying our concern around climate change, does that fit in the budgets? It fits in our domestic budgets for an 80% target. As I say, that's not related to climate change. It does not fit within any decent budgets for 2 degrees C for the UK. So we can be quite clear quantitatively about this, whether it fits or not.
Baroness Sharp, sorry, did you want to come back? Baroness Sharp.
Yes, well, let me sort of carry this forward a little bit. We've talked quite a lot about the use of low-carbon electricity for heating and transport. And in particular, there's been a lot of talk about heat pumps on the one hand and electrifying the transport system on the other. What sort of time frame is it envisaged that electric vehicles and heat pumps will... In what sort of time frame will they be taken up? And secondly, will the electrification of the whole energy system decrease the resilience by reducing diversity? I mean, it's almost bound to, and from the discussion we've been having, it's I think fairly clear that this is so.
Your comment about would widespread electrification decrease resilience? I'm sorry to give you the engineering answer, but it depends how we implement it. Okay. I mean, the answer is you would. I know this is a pretty trite answer, but you would design it so that it didn't.
Yeah.
But I think that's the kind of crux point is you would have to set out to design it so that it didn't. All right. And that implies you have an approach to designing the system which is controlled quite closely. You would almost certainly, that if you're designing for very widespread electrification, you'd almost certainly be looking at local units, if you see what I mean. You'd be breaking it up in that sense to give you the resilience. So I think there's ways and means of doing it, but it implies careful thought, and it implies there is a group tasked with delivering that kind of system design. And this is the kind of thing the IET have been proposing around system architect for the UK and so on. But it implies that, and I think that's correct, that you need that kind of thought in terms of the design standards.
Does the development of microgeneration make this whole question of design much more difficult?
Yes. But again, okay, so it's a fine engineering challenge, if you see what I mean. But yes, it makes it more difficult. Perhaps I should say it to be more precise. It makes it different. Does it make it more difficult? It's debatable. I mean, the real issue is, and to some extent goes to your first part of your question about the kind of rate of take-up of things and rollout of heat pumps or vehicles. It would be very nice to look at kind of the UK or even England or one of the other nations and say, you know, on average, we would see rollout of electric vehicles to the tune of a few % of the car population by 2025. The reality is, what you will probably find is it is very segmented geographically. So for the sake of argument, you know, I'm not picking this for any particular reason, but for the sake of argument, Battersea, going back to your comment, you may find Battersea becomes heavily electrified in terms of vehicles. Now that brings all sorts of local issues around the local distribution systems in that area, but nationally you wouldn't even notice it clearly. So I think that's the challenge, is, you know, the whole point around microgeneration and take-up of some of these new technologies, it brings local issues. You know, where I live on the end of a sort of relatively small grid line, a very few solar installations can push the voltage up in summer, and it causes a problem on the local transformer.
I'm also going to ask you whether, in relation to the air conditioning load, I mean, surely the development of solar installations there will have some effect on this, won't it?
It could do, and I say that carefully. It could do. The reality is, you know, solar works when the sun shines. You may, if you want the air conditioning at the same time, which sounds sensible and logical, then broadly speaking, you may argue the two balance out. If the sun turns off for 30 seconds with a cloud, now you've got a kind of a blip in the system, which has to be managed. So the challenge you quickly come to is, how do you manage storage and those kind of short duration effects? Yeah. But it's all about the system design, I'm afraid, at the end of the day.
I'm going to have to move on. Lord Winston.
Yes, we're running out of time, unfortunately, but perhaps succinctly, whether you'd like to just tell us a little bit about the impact of both the smart grid and also about smart meters and what the barriers are to their implementation. And also, if somebody could give us a word on cyber security, whether you see that as a problem in the future, that would be helpful as well.
Comment on your cyber security one, the answer is yes. There is quite a serious issue there that needs consideration, early consideration. I think there's been a number of challenges, not just around security, but around personal privacy and data, and that's being managed through the smart meter program at the moment. But clearly, everyone's worried about the ability, from a cyber security viewpoint, for tampering with the electricity system. Equally important, though, is tampering with the demand side, because it is very easy, and I know a number of people are worried about the concept of the ability for somebody to change the charging codes, for instance, in electric vehicles, such that they don't all turn themselves on at night, but they do all turn themselves on at 5 o'clock on a Friday, could lead to quite a big cascade failure in a local area. So it is a key issue, absolutely.
And is there a problem about, for example, having a firewall between smart meters and the grid? Does that help? Would that help?
I'd put it in the class of it's a manageable problem in the same way as we manage cybersecurity in other areas, but it needs early consideration, and it's not just a security issue, it's the personal data privacy issue as well, which says it just needs to be thought through very carefully, and the Smart Metering Group and National Grid are working on this.
Finally, if you would, if that's all right, my Lord Chairman, can you give us some estimate about the effect on the resilience of our electrical supply? Is that possible, do you think, or do you think that's just another example?
I haven't got any particular data on it. So.
Well, no, I think, again, we've still got another 2 years to go in the project, but certainly some of the early work, so that smart meters, it depends very much on how they're implemented and how the public responds to them. Because remember, these are something that the public can be dynamically engaged with, and that is always a challenge to predict. So smart meters may well give us an ability to have greater resilience in the grid. Now, also, if you think about that from an intermittency point of view, we are fairly, if we're going to have more renewables on the grid, which we certainly will do in the short term, and from a climate perspective we should do in the longer term, then it may well be that smart metering techniques allow you to look at the weather for the next 6 hours, 2 days and so forth, and start to, via smart metering, start to allow the demand to follow supply. We always have this idea that supply follows demand, but with smart meters and intermittent supply, you can then start to, at least for some areas of demand, you can adjust the demand in accordance with the intermittent supply, if it is as intermittent as some people suggest. So that, in a sense, gives you a greater level of resilience. But also bear in mind that smart meters themselves don't save you any energy, particularly. They might save you a little bit. They allow you to run your system, if they're appropriately put in place, much more efficiently, make more use of your capital stock, reduce your operating costs and so forth. So they don't themselves solve climate change, but they allow you to look at a much more complex system and try to run it in a more efficient manner. But at the moment, the meters we're putting in place, where you effectively just get a little dial that tells you how much energy you've used, these are just less dumb meters. They're not really smart meters. Smart meters are where you start to get some correspondence between your refrigerator and the supply network itself. But then again, I won't go into the cyber issues, but there are lots of protocols you can put in place to try to resolve those, but they're an issue for people who are experts in the area, which I don't think any of us particularly are. So the other thing I'd say, just to re-emphasise that this is not just a technical issue, it is very much a personal issue. That we will get engaged in the same way as solar power is something we've got engaged with. It changes how behaviours use how consumers use energy. Similarly, smart meters may well do that. So we have to be very careful when we design these things to take account there'll be lots more Rumsfeldian unknowns out there.
Now, we've pretty well run out of time. In fact, we've overrun our time, but I know that Lord Ridley and Lord Peston both want to ask questions. No, not Lord Ridley. Very quickly.
Just
10 seconds.
What I'm hearing this morning very clearly is that electrification and renewables policy are a threat to resilience in themselves, or rather, if they're not to be, then they're a threat to affordability. In other words, we can buy resilience in this newer world, but only at a cost.
To draw that together with some of the discussions around the links to policy from Lord Rees and smart meters and things, the policy framework is such that we have the 2050 target for 80%. We have set out, and Parliament and Government have agreed, out to 2027 what measures we think we're doing. There's still a lot of policy that has to be developed in order to meet those targets. We haven't touched on the affordability and the cost side of this, but what is clear is that there is a lower cost way of doing it and there are more expensive ways of doing it, and that was the example of CCS and that was an example of other things. Right now we don't know what technology mix will be the best technology mix and what demand-side response will be the best demand-side response to get us to where we need to be. And that is why it's sensible to be looking at and trialing and piloting a range of different technologies and a range of different measures. And we will see which ones emerge as the most cost-effective ones. But we are, from the committee's point of view, trying to maintain us on that least cost, most cost-effective path and see which ones come out. In terms of specifically the costs of the intermittency, we are, again, and appreciate lots of us have said this, is not much help right now. We're doing a very detailed piece of work right now on the cost of intermittency and trying to understand what it is. We did do a piece of work, which is public, so we can certainly share it, with about 2011 that looked at the cost of intermittency, and that estimated that it would add about 1p per kilowatt hour to build the more resilient network that was needed with the evidence that we had at that point in time. And to give you a sense, 1p per kilowatt hour, we're currently delivering energy to households at about 15p per kilowatt hour. So if that gives you a sort of order of magnitude feel, but there's lots of uncertainty, as we've emphasized, around all of these things.
Just quickly turn that on its head, I think you can make an argument that renewables improve your resilience and affordability because they reduce your susceptibility to price volatility of fossil fuels. And as more demand comes on the fossil fuel market from internationally, from China and other parts of the world, the price of fossil fuels will vary significantly. The price of the wind will remain roughly the same. It doesn't cost much to blow. Yeah, but it's volatility, I said. Volatility goes up and down. Price of fossil fuels goes up and down. And volatility is itself an issue if you're trying to spend money on capital. So I think you could argue, particularly going forward, that there's benefits from affordability perspective. And also, if you look at the capital cost of some of the renewable options now, they're not particularly, if you apply very high market discount rates, they don't work out so well. If you apply more social discount rates like they use in the Green Book, then a lot of the renewables now are on a par with some of the fossil fuels. And you do not have to pay for the fuel afterwards.
Integration costs.
Even if you include the integration costs, yes.
Lord Preston.
Just briefly, just to get the context right as we come to a conclusion, following from Lord Winston's question on smart meters, which are a good idea but have a downside. What worries me about all of our discussion, Professor Anderson pointed out, we have in front of us more computing power than Johnny von Neumann or Alan Turing ever dreamed of when they were winning the war, or rather Alan was. But all of these great technical advances have a downside. You can't hack into an email if you haven't got emails. You can't ruin people's calculations if they aren't able to do incredibly advanced calculations when I used to use a machine which you turned around. So do you agree with that we must place all of this in the context that all the advances, the plus side, clearly always have a minus side?
I agree that there's no free lunch.
Yeah.
And that there is always a cost. There are always a cost associated with these things. But what, in a policy context, and in sort of the question that was before us today in a climate change context, the question is what does the world look like without doing anything, and what does the world look like with doing something, and what are the costs and benefits on either side? Yeah.
So if I can just say, from the point of view, getting to 2050. If you think of it, I was trying to think of it perhaps to some extent in this way. So power, heat and transport, cars. We change cars about every 8 years on average. Okay, so you've got 3 goes at that between now and 2050, maybe 4. We change boilers in houses about every 15 years. You've got 2 goes. That's it. Power stations last 25 to 50 years. So you've got 1 go, and that go is now. Okay, and when you look at those, the first 2, cars and boilers, basically it's a consumer decision, and the technology that goes into your house, anybody's house, is pretty much driven by regulatory standards and legislation in terms of its efficiency and European standards and so on. The power stations, to some extent, driven by regulation and standards and so on, but a lot of it's driven by government policy and what incentives are there to invest. So if you had to look at those kind of 3, then I think there is an important piece that says the consumer is absolutely critical on 2 out of 3. Government's crucial on all of them, but particularly on the power station one. And if you look at getting to 2050, we have about a 10-year window from now to test out whatever options we think we need. And there are options. You know, there isn't one size that fits all. They all come with downsides and penalties, all of them, other than business as usual. So now is the time to focus, I think, on the options, test the options, and then we have to go for a rollout.
I'm going to close the session now because we've overrun. We're most grateful to you. We haven't, I suspect, had a total meeting of minds on every subject, but we have agreed, I think, there's no such thing as a free lunch, and we have agreed that we need to test the options and that the issues are what we don't understand as much as what we do understand. Thank you very much. If we've been at times scratchy, I apologise, but that's because you've stimulated a lively discussion. Thank you very much. Could I welcome Professor Mitchell and I can't read your name now, Dr. Stratton. Thank you very much. Dr. Stachus, yes. I apologise that we were starting a little late, but I know that you've had some challenging travel arrangements to get here, so perhaps you've had time to catch your breath. Could I ask if you would like, first of all, to introduce yourselves for the record, and then if you'd like to either make an opening statement, please feel free to do so. But so, first of all, would Professor Mitchell like to introduce herself?
Yes, I'm Catherine Mitchell. I run the Energy Policy Group at the University of Exeter. And I think we'll just go straight in, I think, for me.
My name is Konstantin Stachus. I am the Secretary General of ENTSO-E. ENTSO-E is the European Network of Transmission System Operators for Electricity. It was established in 2009 following the adoption of the European Union Third Internal Energy Market Package, which prescribes in one of its regulations that all the transmission system operators in Europe need to be members of ENTSO-E and work together to do joint Europe-wide 10-year network development plans and also draft network codes related to technical and market conditions for the cooperation across borders in the European electricity market.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to now ask Lord Browers if he would like to start the questions.
Well, this is the very general and important question. How does electricity resilience in the UK compare to that in other countries in Europe and North America? And are the UK's current and projected capacity margins lower than in the other countries? And how does the resilience of transmission and distribution networks in the UK compare? That's Dr. Stachus, you've got the good European viewpoint.
Yes, maybe if I may, let me start with a general remark about the growing importance of electricity transmission and electricity interconnection with respect to resilience, growing as the European Union in general and the UK in particular are trying to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions from electricity generation and from the energy system in general. There are, of course, different kinds of generation resources that are being pursued, but one very important kind is renewable energy. And especially among the various kinds of renewable energy, the less expensive ones compared to some others of wind energy and solar energy. And both of these operate only when the wind blows and the sun shines. In many parts of Europe for wind, that's then in the neighborhood of 20 to 30% of the time. That has a very important implication for the need for interconnections, because if you want to supply a lot of energy with wind energy, for example, then you need to install quite a bit more wind energy capacity than even your peak load may be. Which then means if there's no wind, you tend to have too little electricity, and if there's a lot of wind, you tend to have too much. That's where the strong European grid comes in, because over a relatively large area like Europe, the wind conditions differ in different parts of Europe at the same time. So the parts of surplus have some probability of being able to export to the parts of deficit. And when we're doing our transmission planning studies on the European basis, we find that much of the economics and 80% of the projects Europe-wide are driven at least partly by renewable energy integration. And the economics of that and our economic studies for that work out largely along those general principles I've been trying to describe. So a strong grid is one of the best ways to keep resilience up as you're investing more and more in renewable energy, and to keep the overall costs of the electricity system affordable to consumers. Now, finally, coming to your original question, of course, with Great Britain being an island, the situation of the interconnections is not so very strong so far towards the continent. That's 3,000 megawatts, and that compares relatively low in terms of interconnection capacity to the countries on the continent that have it easier because they have many neighbors on land. But the interconnection is, of course, only one part of the resilience of the electricity system. The electricity market in Great Britain, England, Wales, Scotland, is already quite a large market with quite a bit of diversity, and it is managed very well in comparison to other parts of Europe with respect to the market arrangements, the duties and the tools that National Grid has at their disposal to keep the system balanced and so on. So from all those perspectives, focusing on Great Britain alone, it's a very positive picture. If you look at the increasing importance of interconnectors for the future as more and more renewable energy comes into the system here and also elsewhere in Europe, more interconnection will have to be built to keep the transition towards low carbon resources affordable and as resilient as possible.
So if I just looked at it in a slightly different way, I think one issue is that thinking about capacity margins in terms of a percent is changing. I think when it was a kind of fossil fuel, nuclear dominated type system, one tended to think that you needed to have a certain percentage over and above that. But as we're moving into a much more integrated and flexible system, I don't think you should necessarily think about things in just in terms of that way. You do need to think about how much storage there might be in the system, or how much demand flexibility there is, or what the interconnectors are. And then just turning to the US, I think that the type of codes and licenses that most of the 50 states in America have, so really you can find any type of system in America in the 50 states, but in general, the system standards are very similar. But one way that the US is far better than Europe and all of Europe actually is to do with demand side response within markets. So the Pennsylvania, New Jersey and Massachusetts, PJM, is a market which sort of has bits of 13 states and covers 51 million customers, which is about the size of Britain. And that, I just have this quote for you so that you would get to see the demand in that market is able to compete in exactly the same way as supply. So, it goes into the same market. And for the 2010 year, which was the capacity in the last 2013-2014, it saved those 51 million customers £12 billion. And it paid for the equivalent, 430 million, to the equivalent of 10 gigawatts. That's in PJM. That's about 12% of projected demand. You bid in to not use it rather than to supply it. So if you have a demand system, a flexible demand system, then when you have issues of capacity or resilient problems, and you have a flexible demand system, then you're much more able to deal with it, and it's cheaper for customers, and it's better for security. So the US now, PJM is the best, and that's about 12% of demand roughly, but the average in the US across those 50 states is still 6%. And if you look at our system here in the UK, which is a market-wide system. It's about 0.5% of demand, and it's not on this. You can't bid in the same way. It is in a very, very poor system in relation to that.
Thank you. Baroness Manningham-Buller.
Can I just pick up one particular point, Professor Mitchell? You compared Europe to the States. In this particular respect, are there countries within Europe that are better than we are at handling this?
We are all trying to think about how we start to bring the demand side into markets. And Germany and Denmark, Italy, Spain, all these places are beginning to do that. And I think that they will become better than us. We've just started to do it through EMR, and I would hope that we will learn and grow and become better, because actually DEC does say that it wants to do this. It's just that the system that it has put in place is something called a market-wide system, which is actually very inflexible. So it's almost the opposite of what you want a demand-side system to be.
One of the things this committee is obviously looking at is where can we learn from other people in the world, and you've given us an example of the States. And Dr. Stash has thought we've got a pretty good system here. But could I ask you, in terms of carbon emissions, intermittency, percentage of renewables used and so on, the question you've already seen in advance, where can we learn from our friends in Europe as well as from America? Because I can't believe we're out ahead of everybody.
Well, the learning within Europe on the precise issue that Professor Mitchell just addressed would probably best focus on those countries which have already rolled out smart meters to their household customers. Italy was first, but then very notably there also are the Scandinavian countries, for example Sweden and Finland, which have made progress on that. And that enables the demand also of household customers to somewhat flexibly react to developments in wholesale prices. I would like to differentiate two effects here. The one is where the customer, through his own choice and action, but perhaps also through home automation or smart homes, decides to react to price developments. And of course, he has to have the prices there, visible to him or to his software. That's the case for industrial customers, for large commercial customers, and in the future with smart meters, that should be the case for household customers as well. This kind of flexibility, we believe, is very important. And then what Professor Mitchell was mentioning was actual bidding systems where the customers of various sizes react to auctions for especially flexible capacity or especially flexible demand. Auctions that usually the transmission system operator, perhaps also the distribution system operators, would be running. And then there needs to be some verification schemes. But if those are in place, and best I know they are in place in the United States, then these can compete on an equal basis with generation resources to deal with fluctuations in renewable energy input and keep the system stable. And in fact, like Professor Mitchell was mentioning, it is also to the best of our knowledge that these demand flexibility resources can compete quite well in terms of costs with generation flexibility resources. So the Nordic countries would be a good learning. I want to mention, if I may, a second kind of learning, which is institutionalized, I'd like to say, through the internal energy market procedures we have in Europe. I mentioned in my brief introduction that ENSO-E has the privilege of drafting network codes that are supposed to cover all cross-border aspects of the market functioning Europe-wide. So for consumers, people that exceed 500 million. And in these codes, we try to look to the future and set conditions which support demand-side response, which support flexible generation resources, which make sure that both demand and generation acts during some instabilities in system operation in such a way that it supports the stability of the system and does not make it detrimental. And among the 10 network codes that we have been drafting, there are 3 that relate to how the market functions. And we're trying to set all these conditions in what ends up being hundreds of pages of the 3 market codes in such a way that the demand-side flexibility is supported, but that the overall resilience of the system is made as strong as possible. And when our members, 41 TSOs from 34 countries, when they sit together and when they draft these network codes, the experience from the front runners in renewable energy integration flows into the overall discussion. The Irish in their small system might have a system inertia problem, too few rotating machines with the masses keeping the system stable. So we benefit from their experience with that particular island-related problem, which might hit the rest of Europe later. The Germans have 75,000 megawatts of renewable energy capacity, roughly, today already, compared to their 80,000 megawatt peak load. That's an awful lot. So they have more experience than the UK and many other countries in how these enormous amounts of renewable energy can be integrated into the system. When we write the network codes, this sort of experience gets integrated in what we write into them.
Yes, well, I suppose I think that, I agree. I think you need a very strong transmission system throughout Europe because of flows. But transmission is just one part of the energy system. And essentially what is happening is that over the last 10, 20 years, we now have a completely new set of technologies, whether it be generating technologies. I mean, we just heard about the rapid change in terms of solar, but also the really big one really is the ICT, which is now used to operate and manage systems. And so you can manage systems in a completely different way than you did before. So the old system where you had a sort of big power plant and it just sort of essentially went down through the system to the customer is how our markets and regulation works and sort of links to those old technologies. But in fact, the energy system is made up of completely different technologies which have got completely different operating characteristics. And the problem is that this old system is the one that kind of gives out the rules and incentives, and then these new technologies have got to fit into that. And I think that is where the problem of resilience is.
Give us a clear idea of what recommendations in that area you would like to see us make.
Well, I do think that you need to rethink the role of the regulator, the role of utilities, and the role of customers. And for example, New York State, which is 31 million people, has got something called Reforming the Energy Vision, and that is an example of a large state which has got obviously a huge, important industry based in New York City, which is trying to do that. Minnesota, Texas, California, all of these are states in America that are trying to take this very solid base of codes, licenses, economic regulation, and so forth, and drag them in to sort of be able to meet the needs of new technologies. And so an example I kind of give this, and forgive me if this is too simple, but if you have a little of it, if you think 20 years ago we were based on landline telephones and telephone boxes, And then we moved into mobile phones, and all you could do with your mobile phone was talk to somebody on it. I would say that is where British economic regulation is. And then if you think about phones now, the kind of speaking to bit of a phone is just one very, very small bit of what a phone does. In fact, almost the talking bit is just one of, you've got maps and internet and, all these kind of things. And the reason why we have smartphones, which we can do so many things with, is a combination of competition and of regulation. Now, in energy, we have all these different technologies which allow us, in theory, to run a system very, very effectively with far less energy. So the stuff that Kevin Anderson was talking about these mega systems, I think are entirely unnecessary. If you get the competition bit right and you get the regulation bit right so that you effectively have, your smart energy system, like you have your smartphone, then I think you end up with a cheaper, more secure, and altogether more resilient system. So it is rethinking the way that we think about energy. And it's not to say, actually, that Ofgem and the department aren't trying to do that, but of course they're in this situation that they have to go from one to the other, and that has got huge distributional impacts about how you do that. If you go down one way compared to going down another way, then that suits one sector versus another sector, and it's obviously not as easy as I've said it. But as I say, many states in the US are now beginning to think like that.
Lord O'Neill.
I've been listening to Catherine Mitchell talking about the American model and comparing it to the UK one, but isn't there one fundamental difference, that in the UK there is a clearly, or an attempted, competitive market, whereas there tends to be local monopolies in the US, and there isn't quite the competitive model that we have in the UK to compare it with. Do you think that makes a difference?
Well, there are 50 states. 17 of them have competitive markets, competitive retail markets, so you have several that you can look at.
Have any of them been the ones you've quoted to us this morning, like the PNGM?
Yes, absolutely. All of those that I've talked about are the competitive markets.
Fine, thank you.
I think one of there are real differences between any electricity system in any country, and you need to always design your electricity system or your energy system to meet that country. But there are so many examples of kind of just sort of sensible practice around the place that I think it's very easy to be able to bring those back from the US or say from Denmark. I mean, somebody was talking about heat pumps, for example, and heat pumps can be incredibly inefficient if you use them sort of singularly, just because of the sort of technical thing. It just happens in Denmark, people tend to live in these kind of apartment blocks, and at the same time they have loads and loads of wind. So sometimes they have 160% of their demand needs. And so what they just do is that 60% effectively goes into their heat pumps, and it acts as storage. Well, that's absolutely brilliant for Denmark. It's not something that would be able to work in Britain. But one can if one learns that from other countries, then you can start to pick and mix so that you can get a system which totally suits Britain.
Sashas, did you want to?
Yeah, I wanted to latch on to some of the things Professor Mitchell just said. I used to know the U.S. market pretty well because I lived there for 14 years when I was younger, including 9 years of work at Pacific Gas and Electric, one of the bigger utilities over there. But that was 20 years ago. I'm still trying to follow it, and indeed we have good contacts to PJM. The numbers Professor Mitchell just said tell an interesting story. Out of 50 states, 17 have a market in the U.S., and a larger number don't. They indeed have the old monopolies, as you were implying. It's a bit unfortunate that the US have not been able to agree nationwide for their 350 million inhabitants on a common model for how they want to arrange the electricity industry, thanks partly to the UK's forerunner role back in the 80s and 90s. Europe has embarked on what I find an amazingly strong consensus that market solutions are the right answer for how to arrange the electricity industry, and that the same kind of basic market arrangements all across Europe with 500 million people is the right answer. From my personal perspective, one aspect of having market solutions is not to be underestimated at this time, and this is the innovation. The innovation that comes from, for example, a big price drop in photovoltaic panels over the last 5 years, the innovation that Professor Mitchell mentioned with respect to better usage of information and communication technology in order to make our homes smarter, in order to make our grid smarter, in order to be able to use storage solutions locally or Europe-wide. And all of this innovation from our perspective can best prosper within the market environment and not in a monopolistic environment like many parts of the southern US still have. So we try to plan the transmission grid and analyze each new interconnector with respect to costs and benefits in a multi-criteria way and with respect to the great uncertainties that we foresee in the future. It's very hard to estimate, for example, whether the photovoltaic cost decreases that we've seen over the last 5 years will continue, and if so, at what pace they will continue, and how cheap photovoltaic power will be even in the year 2020 or 2025. It's also not so easy to estimate how much demand response will there really be from the households. If they have a heat pump, there can be a lot of responsiveness, but not everybody is going to have a heat pump. Not everybody might have an electric car within the next 10 years. And if one doesn't have these large demands within the household, then the benefits from smart meters might be quite a bit less. So we try really hard to send each of 120 Europe-wide transmission projects through a very demanding cost-benefit analysis with hour-by-hour simulations of the year 2030 in 4 very different scenarios. One which has lots of renewable energy, lots of demand response, and will almost certainly need strong grids and also very smart grids at the distribution level. And another scenario at the other end, which is quite conservative and doesn't have anywhere near as much renewable energy, not anywhere near as much innovation in the distribution grid, and then you will need less transmission lines. But even in that conservative scenario, you still need roughly twice as much interconnection Europe-wide as you need now. And the 2 big spots where the biggest investment is needed are Germany, with all the renewables they already have, and the UK, with the interconnections to Norway, to Denmark, to Belgium, to Holland, and to France, that would make the market in the UK much better integrated, so that if the wind blows well in the future, with a lot more wind energy in the UK than today, the operators of those wind parks can still get a decent price for their wind energy in other parts of Europe that they're exporting it to. If the interconnections aren't there and the wind blows well and you've installed a lot of it, you'll need to curtail it. You don't know where to put it, except perhaps in storage, which today is still quite expensive.
And then Baron Shaw.
I've got a bit lost on the difference between market and non-market solutions, and I'd like it clarified. If you are in America, there are some states, I gather, where there's only one supplier. They really have a monopoly. That's right, isn't it? I must say, when I lived in America, I hadn't the faintest.
You usually have area-based suppliers. So in the area that you
so you
live, so there are different companies. No, but you can't switch. No, yeah. That's as domestic customers. There's usually retail competition for bigger customers everywhere.
Right. Okay, but let's concentrate on domestic for the moment. So as an economist, I would define a monopoly as a single supplier.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if we take then to compare with Europe, typically how many suppliers does a household can choose between in a typical European country?
I think Greece is the only country now where domestic supply is with one company.
Well, how many? If you live in Germany, how many companies would you be choosing between?
In Germany, most cities might have around 30 or 50 different...
50 producers of electricity?
Yes.
Producers or suppliers?
Suppliers.
Yes, so somebody you buy from.
But also producers. Keep in mind that several countries put a lot of emphasis on municipal utilities. So in Germany you have 800 municipal utilities. Some of them are big enough to be active on the nationwide market. But also some other countries have municipal utilities. And if you abstract from the municipals, you might in many countries have 5 or 10 offers. But I'm sorry that this isn't exactly my field of expertise, how many there are.
So in Britain we have 20, I think it's either 23 or 27. You have the big 6, and then you have a number of other small suppliers.
So the fact that I don't know the names or how I get in touch with other than the one I've got,
yes.
I'm genuinely in a tiny minority.
EDF actually.
I mean, everybody else in this room knows the names of 20-odd companies they can go to. Yeah, and they
address of the Change website.
No, I think it's an interesting.
No, the fact is that I am not convinced of this. I mean, the point I'm trying to make is I'm not convinced of the market versus the non-market. But I mean, sorry, I've made my point.
I do think an interesting point though about that is that there is no easy way for you to undertake a comparison, and so I think Ofgem should have on their website a comparison, because there are many comparison sites, but they're comparing different things. So, and are often being paid for by customers, by companies on those sites. So I think having a good comparison site that Ofgem sort of sets a template for would be absolutely brilliant for customers.
No, comparison is extremely complicated. Baroness Sharp.
In a sense, is we've covered the question which I was due to ask, which was about capacity markets. But there is one remaining from it that I'd like to ask, which is that if Dr. Mitchell is right, Professor Mitchell is right in saying that we are using, in a sense, the methods that are now a decade old or more than that. Does this not have very serious implications in terms of the choice of infrastructure that we're now due to make? I mean, this is a very real problem, because if we're going to, in a sense, install an infrastructure that is much less flexible than the way the market is developing and the need to have this enormous flexibility, as you were saying, things like the development of solar on the one hand, of heat pumps on the other, the microgeneration issue, is not at the moment captured within the model that DEC is using.
Yeah, I agree. So I should say that Margaret was a role model for me. I used to work with her in my very earliest stage a long time ago. No, I agree. So can I just say two things? One is about the capacity market that we have in Britain, and the other is about the innovation side of things. So the capacity market that we have in Britain now is a market-wide system which simply gives money to, because they're there. It's not asking them to do anything, about their capacity, their capabilities, or what makes the system more flexible. And it is a very poor system. And I've written on that. Very happy to send stuff into you if you want to have more on that. And because it is the kind of system it is it is not supporting flexibility. And really what you need in this very rapidly changing world is a combination on the one hand of a sort of an overseer, some kind of framework that is trying to keep everything together, and flexibility around the edges so that you can keep up with these enormous changes that are going on. And I like the Energinet model, which is in Denmark, whereby Energinet is a system operator. It's a state-owned system operator, and it has been given the responsibility for security and for the transition to the kind of low-carbon system. So you have something that is technically able to keep track of what is going on. And at the same time, the changing kind of rules to do with codes and licenses and all the rest of it feed into that. And that seems to me to be a way that manages keeps the flexibility to whatever might suddenly happen, at the same time ensures security. So unlike having this market-wide payment, what it does, which is what most states in the US do, or what many places in Britain does, if they feel that they need some more capacity of some requirement, then Energinet, this system operator, is able to say we need 300 megawatts of this, and then that can be competitively put out if you need it. But then if you don't need it, you don't have it. Whereas our kind of capacity mechanism is just based on sort of giving out this money, and we don't, things change all the time, and it may be completely unnecessary, and it is the customers that pay in the end.
Would it be possible for you to do a short paper on that,
I can send that,
and let us have that?
Yeah.
Can I ask Professor Mitchell and indeed Dr. Wood a simple question here? I was particularly interested in this issue that you brought from the States about demand as a market lever. Could I ask you this question, that if in fact demand becomes a major market lever, and 12%, as you were talking about, is a very, very significant market lever, would there be sufficient resilience in the current interconnector system to avoid you having to increase significantly base load capacity?
Well, so the situation about interconnectors is, I think, incredibly interesting. Somebody was asking about what's the cost of electricity in Europe. So we are kind of middle ranking in terms of our retail price of electricity. But if you look at our wholesale price, I think there's only kind of like 2 or 3, Cyprus and somewhere else, which is higher than us. We have very high wholesale prices. One of the reasons why we have very high wholesale prices is because we have, I think, 2% of our total capacity is interconnected, and the Commission wants to have roughly 10%. And the reason why this is my view. I'm sure many people would say it's very simplistic, but I think it's been in the interests of the large generators in Britain not to have interconnectors, because if you were to have interconnectors, then cheaper electricity would come in from the continent. The way that we have our regulation of the way that we fund our interconnectors has always been that it is a market thing, and it's based on the interconnector itself, as compared to the whole of the rest of Europe, which sees interconnectors as part really of the transmission system. And so you go along to your regulator says you can have the money to do that, and then you socialise that over the kind of cost of electricity. We have been forced to kind of go down a third way because our British system has not fitted with the European system, and now we've kind of got some fudge so that it does, but it still requires a derogation from the European Commission to do it. And and so overall, if we sort out, well, this is part of this issue that I'm talking about, that we have a set of sort of regulations which are based on older technologies, and we need to move into regulations which fit the kind of world that we live in. So we need to sort out our interconnectors in order to do that. And then at that point, if we were to kind of go up to 10% of our supply with interconnectors, and you're being able to move power around, which is good, you know, in every way, then yes, obviously you don't need to have what would have been 10% of generation. Absolutely.
Yes, please.
Could I add a few thoughts to that? Relating to the role of Energinet DECO in Denmark, they are the TSO identified by the Danish government, just like National Grid is the TSO identified by the UK government for Great Britain, and they have very similar roles. The transmission system operators in all of Europe have been unbundled in 3 waves. As I mentioned, the idea originally came from the UK, and Europe has largely copied that, along with other parts of the world, where if you want to have competition in electricity, the only way to get the power from a competitive producer to any customer is through the grid. So the grid has to be neutral, and that's why it needed to be unbundled in the past decades from the interests of supply, from the interests of generation in particular. And that's happened all over Europe in ways that are rather similar to each other, even if not entirely identical. And that's why then the TSOs here in the UK and the TSO in Denmark and elsewhere have very similar roles: keep the lights on first and foremost, and facilitate the market functioning, and also support the energy policy goals. And if the energy policy goals in all of Europe and in the UK say decarbonize as much as you can the electricity sector, then that becomes, and I know that's the case in the UK, that becomes a big objective driving the regulator Ofgem, and it becomes a big objective driving the TSO National Grid, just like in Denmark. So that's why the transmission system operators believe and try to prove through the cost-benefit analyses that under different future scenarios, transmission helps keep the transition to a low-carbon future affordable. But that's why they also very strongly support the introduction of more and more innovation and smarts into the distribution grid and into the interactions of the customers with the market. We don't talk very often about the smart transmission grid because we like to think it's already very smart. Every 2 or 3 seconds, measurements from the entire system come together in the control center and get used to keep the system resilient. They get used, as National Grid, I believe, explained to you already, to make simulations for the next minutes and the next hour to make sure that whatever happens in the grid, a line going out because of a storm, a power plant having a forced outage, whatever single thing happens won't lead to an overload on any part of the system, won't lead to a blackout. And some of the network codes I've been mentioning earlier are describing, based on the best practice Europe-wide and the best anticipation of the challenges of the future with more renewables, how precisely to run the software in all the control centers in Europe, so that also we avoid that one with less optimal processes becomes a blackout risk for their neighbor, even if they may have better processes. Can DSR, can demand-side response, avoid baseload capacity? We feel that's another reason why our 10-year network development plans might be useful to policymakers, political deciders like you, but also to the market participants, because we try to open up a broad range of scenarios how the future might develop, and then show through the precise simulations how are the market prices in this future, how do they fluctuate from one hour to the other. If there's more and more renewables, the market prices will fluctuate a lot, and there may not be so many what we call base load hours left, because once you subtract from the load the generation coming from zero operating cost renewables, you may in some or in many hours have very little left. So that's why the economics of baseload generation have been changing slowly throughout Europe. And our 10-year network development plans try to give a picture of how this would look in the different scenarios with the foreseen amount of baseload generation and the foreseen amount of renewables. But I would strongly agree demand-side response is a necessary ingredient to keep the system manageable.
Can I just say one thing about that, actually? The thing about EnergyNet is that it is state-owned. It is not a private company, as National Grid is here. So there's a difference of ownership. First of all, the security is placed on them as a responsibility. It is not part of the market as it currently is here in Britain. And it, as EnergyNet has been given both security and transformation as their responsibility, it gets rid of this incredibly unhelpful competition between transmission and the distribution network operators. And that's why I like the EnergyNet model. So I agree that there are all these transmission companies all over the place, but actually, depending on the responsibilities that they're given and their ownership, they are very, very, very different animals. And it's that particular sort of a characteristic that is so good about EnergyNet going into the future, because it enables appropriate choices to run the system most efficiently to be made, really, rather than this kind of differentiation between DNOs and transmission.
My question relates to electricity prices in UK and the rest of the EU, and to a degree, Professor Mitchell, you answered part of the question about the electricity prices being higher in the United Kingdom. So what is the other countries in the EU look like for electricity prices?
So I did bring, and I'll leave with you. I had made all those questions you asked me. I kind of got all the websites for all the answers, and I looked it up.
Maybe we could have those out.
Yes,
later.
yeah. So you can see this kind of set of average wholesale prices, and then the additional taxes and levies on top of that. So if you add it, all the lot together, then Britain is sort of like in the middle of all of these electricity prices. If you just look at the wholesale price, we're near the top, and we have very little in terms of levies and extra bits on our prices.
Reflect in consumer prices.
So in terms of consumer prices, the retail price, we're sort of in the middle, roughly. Yeah. I absolutely think that. So there's two things going on. First of all, I think if there is more interconnection, then prices would come down, and that would also be more secure. There is this issue though about variable power. So if you are in a country with a lot of variable power, because markets are based on zero marginal costs, it takes the zero marginal cost electricity first of all. So it takes the renewables first. And that shunts over the more expensive kind of fossil fuel stuff. It just moves it over. So fossil fuels which have higher variable costs won't get into the market anymore. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that often that variable power happens at the time of peak prices, and because it's zero marginal cost, those peak prices come right down. And that is why countries with a lot of variable power have much lower wholesale prices. Now, at the moment, we're subsidising them. But once that subsidy has gone, then you have basically got the zero price marginal costs. And that's why the innovation thing is to kind of get through to that. Now, when you have a marginal cost market, which tend to happen every half hour, you pay the price of that half an hour for that last bit of electricity you've bought in a sort of a traditional market. And so absolutely everything underneath that is paid that high price. Well, if all of a sudden you've got more and more variable power and you're bringing down your peak price, then it's not just that your peak price is coming down, but you're paying a whole lot less underneath that as well. And so on the whole, as you're getting more and more variable power come into the system, you are going to end up with lower wholesale prices.
Why do some countries end up having higher taxes?
Well,
Denmark, Germany.
Yeah, Germany is a really good example of a country which is just getting to the point where all the kind of higher prices that it has put on, not just for renewables and energy efficiency, but also environmental things, is starting to move into lower overall wholesale wholesale prices. So those extra bits that some countries are putting on will be, on the whole, to do with environmental levies or whatever it might be.
Okay. Lord Breyers want to come in. I'm sorry we're running a bit late, so we keep it short.
Just a quick question. I mean, US electricity is half our cost, both domestic and industrial. I mean, we're lower than Germany, although the Germans' generation cost is slightly lower.
Yes, wholesale, that's right. Yeah.
What are the Americans doing? Is their electricity producing much more carbon? Is that the reason? Or is it, I mean, the factor of 2 is huge. And for industrial companies, it's a massive disadvantage. And it's a massive disadvantage that Europe's setting itself against America. I just wonder, I think we've got to try to understand that a bit.
Well, it's...
If you compare especially industrial electricity prices, they will have a relatively smaller network component in them because they're connected at higher voltage levels, and the higher voltage levels per kilowatt hour are relatively cheaper than the lower distribution voltage levels. So the wholesale price becomes a much more dominating part of an industrial electricity price than it is for household customers, where there's a lot more network fee in it, and where also some of the countries at least are putting all these taxes and levies and renewable energy subsidies, and they're trying to keep the renewable energy subsidies to some extent, as far as legal within the EU, away from the industrial power prices to at least keep them as competitive as possible. So then you have in the end, comparing US and EU or British industrial customer electricity prices, they're dominated by the wholesale market price. And if your gas is a lot cheaper, as it is in the US now, because of the shale gas, than it is here in Europe, then the overall generation cost in the US ends up being cheaper, almost by necessity, than it can be here.
It just seems the same when you look at it. I mean,
yeah.
The ratio's the same, and presumably we can do the same thing. We can supply large users at higher voltage, can't we?
Yeah, you do, but you don't have the cheap gas here, as they do in the US.
I think it's a combination of things, really. I mean, it's partly resources. It's partly that they have something called public utility commissioners, whose job it is to keep track of prices to customers. And so even it's sort of a hybrid method. So although we would call it competitive in the sense of retail, these regulators are, every time anybody wants to sell to a customer, they have to go through the Public Utility Commissioner. And that means that there's a very, very close look at the need for somebody to say they need to have another power plant. And that's why the demand side is so much bigger in the States. So but it's also a combination of the pool. So you have a different electricity market, you have different sorts of regulators which keep much closer track of prices to customers, and because of that you have a far better demand side. And so it goes back to this point that I was talking about if you lower the peak price, that also reduces all the prices underneath. And the demand side, if you have demand side, you are routinely bringing down the price of electricity in that half hour by 2/3 or something like that. That was what, I had that 12 billion saved. That was that it had also brought down the price by 2/3. So, the demand side isn't just about creating more resilience. It's actually causing the whole price of electricity for that half an hour to come down as well. So it's this combination of methods, which is why, given this complexity of the system now with the needs of climate change, but also all these new technologies, we really should be rethinking the role of the regulator, the role of utilities, and the role of customers.
Now that brings me to a question about EU regulation, and you've given us some very firm advice that the regulators, not just in Britain but in Europe, should be trying to embrace the new technologies and develop the opportunities, as you say, other parts of the world seem to have done quite successfully. So what is it that you would expect of the EU regulator if we are to achieve a greater resilience and to be able to capture some of these obvious benefits that you've demonstrated elsewhere?
Look, I don't know. I don't know what you would say to this, but I quite like the idea of... so I'm fine about the way policies work, really, but I quite like the idea of a European regulator, a transmission regulator, like FERC in the States. What would you think of that? Because actually, I don't know.
Well, there is already the Agency for the Cooperation of Energy Regulators, ACER, that has been instituted in the same Internal Energy Market Package of the year 2009 when ENSO-E also was founded. And they do what their name implies. They try to coordinate the various EU national regulatory agencies' work so that it fits together EU-wide. They provide a lot of opinions and some oversight over the ENSO-E work, but they also try to find consensus among national regulators when it's difficult. You may, for example, have transmission line projects that cover at least 2 or sometimes even 3 or 4 countries. Think, for example, about the North Sea offshore connections that will go among different countries through the middle of the North Sea. The regulatory details can differ quite a bit from one country to another, and that may make it difficult for them to agree among each other which part of the cost of such a subsea cable might need to be charged to the Belgians, the Dutch, and to the British customers. And if and when they do have trouble agreeing on something important like that, which can even block an investment if you're not careful, then that agency in Ljubljana can step in and hopefully bring them to a consensus. So my members in ENSO-E, they are the regulated companies. Each one of them is subject to very important regulation in their country on tariffs, on procedures, on congestion management, and many, many other things. We have been calling in international fora in Europe for a strengthened hand for ACER, for this regulatory cooperation agency, because we feel that the international cooperation needs to improve if we want to keep a low carbon system affordable to the consumers for the reasons I've mentioned, and that international cooperation cannot prosper as well as it should if the regulators cannot agree with each other. So this function of making them come together more, agreeing more, is very, very important for us.
Lord Patel.
Yes, it relates to research, and very quickly, who in Europe is doing research into new technologies to maintain resilience in the future, and what contribution is Horizon 2020 European program making towards this R&D?
I don't know about that. I mean, I suppose my view is that learning by doing is kind of like the best way forward. And so those countries which, start to do things and then learn on the job are the ones that do show innovation. And so...
And who are they?
Well, Germany and Denmark probably, but also Italy, Spain, probably as well. to a degree. And I think the thing about Britain is Britain's sort of good theoretically, but because we're terribly proud about sort of finding out the problems before we do anything at all, but then we don't actually do anything at all. We just theoretically kind of good at it, and I'm sure that's actually true. And I wouldn't say that, but I just don't think that you learn quite. Can I just go back to the thing about having a strengthened regulator, I think I support that, but I also support a smaller regulator in member state countries. So we have Ofgem, which is the economic regulator, who essentially is sort of responsible for everything. And I think it makes much more sense that role becomes much smaller, as in Denmark. So it's like just one aspect, and that you have this system operator that is responsible for transmission and security and so forth. And then you have a European-wide regulator. So you will run into problems if you have a strong country member state regulator and the strong European regulator. And I think it's good to have one at a European-wide level, and that the state regulator has a different function. This is part of this whole thing of rethinking the roles of all these people, has a different function. And again, that fits very much with the Danish model.
I know we're out of time, but we have two documents that I'd like to send your clerk for the record. One addressing the question of fostering investments in the grid as a function of how it's regulated. So that's the question of just now. And another one that gives data about the next winter's resilience in the power system country by country, week by week.
Very grateful for those two documents, but also the information that Professor Mitchell referred to earlier. You brought, I think, some answers about comparative costs between countries, which we'd be very interested to hear. And if you were able to give us your further thoughts about regulation and the relationship between Europe and national countries, I think that would be very helpful. I'm conscious that we've had to curtail some of the discussion on some interesting issues which we could have discussed in much greater depth had we had the time. As it is, I'm afraid we've impinged on your patience by going rather longer than we said we would. Thank you very much indeed to both of you. We have learnt a lot from your evidence. Thank you for taking the trouble to come.
Very welcome.